the astounding thing is that this is being promoted by a Conservative government, well, a Conservative party in government. But on the other hand, there's also been significant intimidation within churches to silence. Now, I think the churches have things to answer for.
We are privileged to be able to interview Canon Chris Sugden today. He is one of the founders of the Anglican-mainstream.net website, and you can log on to that to find out more about what we'll be discussing today. And indeed, we'll be discussing same-sex marriage and the redefinition of marriage. Now, most site visitors watching this video will know about government's plan to redefine marriage, and as we speak, those plans are currently underway. But what most site visitors don't know, and those watching this video, are perhaps the consequences, and far-reaching consequences at that this legislation is likely to have. Canon Chris, could you fill us in on some of these consequences and just how it will affect us personally and as a society as a whole?
Well, you're right to say it has far-reaching consequences, Laura. What the government is proposing is basically genderless marriage, to take gender out of marriage and remove marriage totally from anything necessarily to do with parents and children at all. The driver for this is the understanding that people who have same-sex attraction, that's about 2% of the population, feel that problems that they have of feeling excluded leads to issues of depression or leads to illness, leads to some of them wanting to change from same-sex attraction. They will be solved by saying, well, the societal norm should not be heterosexual marriage because that makes them feel outsiders. The societal norm should be a genderless marriage. Everybody can form, any sort of sexual contract, which will mean that they feel the same as everybody else. Now, actually, that's not the case, because one of the consequences of that will be, at the moment, that no one is allowed to suggest that real marriage is between a man and a woman. And out in the bill itself, adultery is not given as a cause for marital breakdown, because how can you have adultery between two men? How can you have consummation between two men? Which becomes itself unfair to people who are heterosexual. So it actually means that there's now a discrimination, if the bill goes through, against people who are in heterosexual marriage, because they can be faulted for adultery, those in same-sex marriage can't. So when they say, well, of course, two gays contracting a marriage will have no effect on their heterosexual people living next door, the answer is that's nonsense. It will have a grave effect, because it will actually mean that none of us are married in the sense that we have understood it for centuries and millennia.
You call this real marriage on your website, as opposed to traditional marriage.
Yes.
I suppose my next question really has to be, how will this legislation affect our society? Now, there are many changes. Funding for it is one of those. Could you take us through some of the things that will be affected?
Well, there'll be a bill of £5 billion to start with, and that's the figures that Stonewall have given for bringing all the changes necessary in their view to this £5 billion. Now, in the age of austerity, can we afford that? But there will be a cost, huge cost paid by anybody who receives any form of state funds, state aid. So if your salary is paid for by the state, if you're a registrar or a doctor or a teacher, anybody whose salary comes from the state, you will not be allowed to suggest that there's any difference between real marriage and same-sex marriage.
So we're talking about teachers, we're talking about therapists, or
we're talking about counsellors, but we're not just talking about people's professions and careers, that people with solid Christian views on this matter won't be able to be involved in, and that will have some interesting effects. We're talking about organisations. We're talking about charities. Charities receive great help from gift aid. Churches, their property is often rented out to groups that receive government funding one way or another, nursery schools, things like that. All that will be stopped, because I was at a church in Exeter 18 months ago, and I was told that because of their teaching on real marriage, the local council would no longer allow organisations that received funding from them to book the church property. So their income went down 40% straight away. I think people are really unaware that these have huge implications right through society. I was rung up by one council candidate for the elections, the local elections, who was talking to me, and I said, well, I will be voting for somebody who stood for real marriage. And she said, oh, well, you know, it's not a very important issue. A few dotty people who are worried about equality, isn't that at all? I said, absolutely not. It's huge ramifications. For example, they will change the normal understanding of male, female, man, woman, mother, father, as the binaries, the sort of the complementarities in humanity. So you can't refer to those. You have to refer to homosexual or heterosexual, and that will be taught to children in the law as it's framed. Teachers will have to explain this to children. Maria Miller said not necessarily endorse, but how you actually navigate that line with children or teenagers between explaining and endorsing, because if you explain something to children, they'll soar as eggs want to go and experiment with it.
Well, kind of, what if I'm a teacher, and there are many teachers probably watching this, and I don't believe in same-sex marriage, I don't believe in teaching that to children. What will happen to me? What if I'm a registrar, and I don't believe in officiating a marriage between two men or two women? What will happen to me?
I think you'll get a P45 fairly quickly.
So dismissal then?
I think so. It's happened already. We've seen cases in the paper, well publicised cases of registrars who have lost their job, chaplains who've lost their jobs over this, because they have suggested that that is their beliefs, and they cannot themselves, for reasons of personal integrity, they cannot be part of a process that teaches people what is wrong.
Well, it seems as though a lot of this information has actually been kept away from the public. We certainly haven't heard of anything to this extent. Why is the state doing this? Why are they so intent on pushing this forward without letting us know the full consequences of their actions?
Well, it's very clever PR. There is a political driver behind it, framed in David Cameron's conference speech, where he said, I don't believe in gay marriage in spite of being a conservative. I believe in it because I'm a conservative, because I think marriage is wonderful, I'm a great supporter of marriage, I want it for everybody. Now those words, although that notion wasn't provided for him, it came from Peter Tatchell. Peter Tatchell himself has written on his own website that those words come from an article that Peter Tatchell himself wrote. So Peter Tatchell has given the Prime Minister these ideas, and they're backed up by a notion that's called civic conservatism, which is that in the economic sphere, and a senior colleague of mine who founded Anglican Mainstream with me and others, Vinay Samuel, has been articulating this. Civic conservatism, as expounded by somebody like David Willits, expresses the fact that you take, in the economic sphere, people's self-interest, that they want to amass as much wealth as they can, and you create institutions that enable the natural reciprocal altruism of people to flourish, so that you turn what is self-interest into something that becomes altruism through institutions. And you do that in the economic sphere. Now they've taken that into the cultural and social sphere and said what we'll do is we'll take the natural self-interest of people to indulge their physical pleasures, and we will take an institution like marriage to enable natural reciprocal altruism. And the institution of marriage is there to encourage faithfulness. It's for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death us do part. It's about the bonding of parents and children. It's about all those things. It's given not just to enable us all to have an everlasting honeymoon, but to say there are going to be bad times, and in those bad times, you know, even if it's worse for you, you're committed to each other, even though it's worse for you. That's not natural altruistic altruism. It's taking seriously that we are naturally selfish, and we need encouragement and training to help overcome those things. We're about to get rid of all that by law.
It seems as though the state is taking on a role that they are not entitled to have, and it's affecting our freedom of conscience, it's affecting our freedom of speech. And could you enlighten us, could you expand on that a little bit more?
Well, the astounding thing is that this is being promoted by a Conservative government, well, a Conservative party in government. The Conservative Party supposedly stands for family, for liberty, that society is best, flourishes best when you have little republics, the little republics of the family, the little republics of communities, the little republics of the parish, the little republics of civic organisations. That's when society flourishes best, and you give them freedom within certain boundaries. That's their understanding of the state, in their normal philosophy. This is astounding, that they're saying, no, in this area you will not have freedom. In this area, in fact, the state takes over as parent, because the state will decide what your children are taught about marriage and family. The state will decide what your children are taught about sex. And one of the very disturbing things is currently, even before this law is passed, in the education syllabus in schools, what is available to children, one click away, it's not compulsory, but one click away, is some very disturbing material that I think if parents knew that this was being made available to children, they would be horrified, and they would want to take their children out of those classes. They can at the moment, but if this becomes law, they can't, because the argument is, in order to stop bullying, exclusion, everything else, these things have to be explained to children, and children will quite rationally understand and make the right decisions. Well, I don't think the people who are proposing that have any understanding of children.
It seems as though a small minority is enforcing their ideals on the rest of society. Are Christians, and have they been, completely excluded from the public square in this issue, and how can they make their voice heard in the midst of all of this?
Well, I think it's been, there's been a twin-pronged approach, I think. I think you're quite right that Christians have been, there's been this very sort of aggressive atheism we've seen in the last few years, which has suggested that anybody with any religious ideas, wherever they come from, is as superstitious and is irrelevant to public debate as believers in Melanesian frog worship. The Christian church in this country has always believed that it's got a contribution to make to public debate. And in fact, Archbishop Justin Welby, in his installation sermon, made that point very powerfully. If you look at the whole, abolition of slavery, introduction of universal education, the Factory Acts, prison reform, were all down to Christian involvement in public debate and concern. But on the other hand, there's also been significant intimidation within churches to silence. Now, I think the churches have things to answer for. I haven't heard a sermon on the nature of sex in church since I was a student. Why is it the case that we, in the scriptures, says that sexual relationships should be between a man and a woman for life, husband and wife? And the answer is the meaning of sex. Sexual intercourse means you only for me for life, and responsibility for any children conceived. That's what it means. It's a performatory act in the philosophical terms. It means something. The trouble is nowadays it's treated as significant as a handshake. If you are living together, having sex, you are married in the sight of God. All you're doing now is being public about it. The ideal thing is that the public and private should come together. So, A, the churches haven't done a proper teaching. Secondly, when it comes to this particular matter in the last 2 or 3 years, frankly, many churches and many pastors have been intimidated. And they've been intimidated by a few members of the congregation who don't agree and raise concerns. There was a well-documented and publicised case of a lay reader in a church in South London who just had the C4M, Campaign for Marriage, petition for people to sign. He announced it from the leader up the front, said if people like to sign this, it's at the back of the church. And I think he was suspended from duties by the church leadership because people said, oh, this is divisive. You're introducing division in the church. Well, the church is divided about a lot of things. You know, the church has divisions over Trident missiles, the church has divisions over how you give aid to developing countries, all sorts of issues. That, you know, why is this one the one on which people are silenced, and which you don't talk about, and you don't even have a debate about? The government have rushed into this, they have rushed into it, to try and overturn an institution that has thousands of years testing behind it, in order to try and help a group of people who say this will help us, on the basis of very little evidence. There's no evidence so far in the long term that this provides stability. There's no evidence that this addresses the issues they wanted to address, and there's no evidence that the majority of people in that situation even want marriage. It adds nothing to what they've got. It doesn't add any more rights. The only reason they're campaigning for it is, as I said at the beginning, this notion of we feel excluded.
Do you feel as though in the coming years to come we'll have a lot more churches being sued on this topic, and what protection does the state afford them?
Well, the evidence we have is that someone, for example, like the Secretary of Changing Attitude, has said just in the last few days that they will be bringing cases against those clergy, those churches who will not conform to either giving blessings to those in same-sex relationships, or when the law comes, performing same-sex marriages.
They said
very clear.
Very clear.
They've said very clear they're going to bring cases.
And what protection does the state afford those churches?
Well, the Culture Secretary believes that there's a fourfold lock, in her words, that means this won't happen, but legal opinion is heavily divided on the matter, and this will obviously then be taken right up to the European Court of Human Rights. So the lawyers will have a field day over this. Meanwhile, a lot of churches will be put into very difficult positions. People will be intimidated. That's how this strategy is moving forward. Partly intimidation, threats, and I can quite see that a number of churches, for the sake of a quiet life, you know, will conform. Some will be very clear and say they won't conform, and a lot of Christian time, money, energy and everything else will be misdirected into these particular issues. We should absolutely deluge the MPs to show that this is not something that has the support in the vast majority of the country. We should seek to make sure that more Conservative MPs vote against this in the third reading. I think that there should be very serious questions about who we vote for in the council elections coming up at the end of April, beginning of May, and not to vote for any candidate who will not speak up for real marriage. And I was talking to one senior Conservative lady just at the beginning of this week, who said, it's on this issue and this issue alone that I resigned after 34 years of campaigning for the Conservative Party, because of my Christian principles and because this is wrong, and I'm not prepared to continue supporting them for this reason. And that message has got to be heard. I think the Prime Minister is aware of it. One or two changes have been made, but I think we've got to press on and make it very clear that there's no way that many Christians would ever vote for the Conservative Party while this is on their policy agenda, and therefore this is David Cameron's last few months as Prime Minister.
Well, you've heard it from Canon Sugden. Make a stand, make your voice heard, write to your MP and do what you can. And if you'd like to find out more information, you can log on to his website, and that's www.anglican-mainstream.net. Thank you very much for joining us, Canon Sugden.